The year was 1879. The sky over Needles Gulch had turned the color of a fresh bruise, and then it broke open. It wasn't rain that fell, not at first. It was hail, hard and white as bleached bone, hammering the tin roofs of the fledgling town and stripping the leaves from the cottonwoods that lined the creek. The sound was a roar, a relentless drumming that drove men indoors and sent cattle scattering for the scant cover of the bluffs. The hail turned to a torrential downpour, a solid sheet of gray water that sluiced down the rocky slopes of the gulch, turning the normally placid Silver Creek into a churning, frothing beast. The water, thick and brown with mud and torn earth, rose with an unnatural speed, swallowing its banks and clawing at the foundations of the town itself. It carried with it the debris of the high country's splintered pine branches, the carcass of a deer, and a prospector's forgotten cradle, all tumbling end over end in the violent current. The wooden bridge that spanned the narrowest point of the gulch, the town's only reliable artery to the west, groaned under the assault. Its stout timber legs, sunk deep a decade ago, now trembled as the floodwaters slammed against them. The water was a living thing, hungry and loud, its voice a constant, guttural scream that echoed off the canyon walls. Through this maelstrom rode Cole Mercer. He sat his gray Mustang, Flint, with the kind of stillness that is born only from a lifetime spent in the saddle, a stillness that defied the chaos around him. The wide brim of his hat was soaked through, channeling a steady stream of icy water down his neck and under the collar of his heavy wool coat. The coat itself felt like it was made of lead, its weight a cold, constant pressure on his shoulders. He kept one gloved hand firm on the reins, his knuckles white, the other resting on the saddle horn, feeling the powerful muscles of the horse bunch and release beneath him as Flint picked his way cautiously along the treacherous, mud-slicked path that passed for a road. Cole's face was set, his jaw tight, his pale blue eyes narrowed against the driving rain as he scanned the raging creek. He wasn't heading for town, but past it, to the small ranch he was trying to carve out of the unforgiving land at Coyote Bend. Every rise in the creek was a threat to his fences, every minute of this storm a danger to his herd. He was nearing the bridge when a sound, sharp and unnatural, cut through the storm's roar. It was the shriek of stressed metal and the panicked, high-pitched whinny of a horse in mortal terror. Cole's gaze snapped toward the bridge. There, caught in the very heart of the flood's fury, was a wagon. A small, sturdy medicine wagon, its canvas top flapping wildly in the wind, was skewed at a dangerous angle, one of its rear wheels having slipped off the edge of the planking where the water had torn a section away. The horse in the traces, a solid-looking bay, was plunging and rearing, its eyes wide with fright, fighting the pull of the current that threatened to drag the entire rig into the torrent. A figure was struggling with the reins, a slight figure in a dark, soaked dress, their bonnet lost to the wind. A woman. She was trying to soothe the horse, her voice lost in the storm, while desperately trying to keep the wagon from sliding further into the abyss. For a long moment, Cole just watched, his mind a cold, quick calculator of risk and possibility. The bridge was dying. He could see the main support beam on the far side beginning to give way, splintering under the relentless pressure. To venture onto it was folly. To do nothing was to watch a woman and her horse be swept away to their deaths. There was no real choice. He urged Flint forward, the horse's hooves sucking at the thick mud. He stopped at the edge of the bridge, dismounting in one fluid motion. "Hold him steady," he yelled, his voice a raw bark that somehow carried over the din. He didn't wait for an answer. He uncoiled the thick lariat from his saddle, the wet hemp heavy and stiff in his hands. He took a precious few seconds to test the footing at the entrance to the bridge, his worn leather boots finding a precarious purchase on the slick, trembling planks. He anchored himself against a main piling, wrapping his legs around it, feeling the entire structure shudder with each fresh wave that smashed against it. With a powerful flick of his wrist, he sent the rope snaking out over the water. The loop was perfect, sailing through the rain and settling cleanly over the axle of the stranded rear wheel. He pulled the slack tight, the rope groaning as it took the strain. "Turn your horse into the bridge. Give him his head when I pull," he commanded. The woman, her face a pale oval in the gray light, looked at him. Her eyes, wide and dark, met his for a fraction of a second. There was fear in them, but also a stubborn flicker of resolve. She nodded, her shoulders set, and turned back to her terrified animal, speaking to it in a low, urgent tone that Cole couldn't hear but could feel in the set of her jaw. Cole dug his heels in, leaning back, putting every ounce of his weight and strength into the rope. The muscles in his back and shoulders screamed in protest. The wet hemp bit viciously into his gloved hands. He could feel Flint behind him, instinctively holding his ground, a rock in the chaos. Now he roared. The woman gave a sharp cry and slapped the reins. The bay horse lunged forward, scrambling for purchase on the slippery planks, its iron-shod hooves striking sparks. At the same moment, Cole hauled on the rope, a brutal, grunting effort that felt like he was trying to pull the whole world back from the brink. The wagon scraped and shrieked, the wheel grinding against the broken edge of the bridge. For a terrible, heart-stopping moment, it didn't move. The current sucked at it, pulling it sideways, and Cole felt the piling he was braced against shift ominously. The bridge was going to pieces under his feet. Then, with a final, desperate lunge from the bay and a last, agonizing heave from Cole, the wheel caught. It lurched up onto the solid planking with a deafening crack, and the wagon rolled forward, safe. The woman guided her trembling horse the remaining distance to the bank where Cole stood. She didn't get down. She just sat there, her hands still clutching the reins, her chest heaving as she drew in ragged breaths. The rain plastered her dark hair to her scalp and streamed down her face, mixing with what might have been tears. Cole stood panting, the now slack rope hanging from his hand. Their eyes met again, holding this time across the few feet that separated them. The world seemed to fall away, the roar of the storm fading to a dull hum. He saw in her eyes a depth of exhaustion and terror that went beyond the last few minutes. It was a weariness that seemed to be etched into her very soul. Her lips parted, and her voice, when it came, was a raw, breathless whisper, barely audible. "You're the only one who ever got this far." The words hung in the air, strange and heavy with a meaning he couldn't grasp, before he could process them. A flicker of movement from the town drew his eye. The door of the Silver Needle Saloon, the largest and loudest building in the settlement, was cracked open. A few faces were framed in the yellow lamplight, bearded and curious, watching the drama at the bridge. Cole saw their mouths moving, and though he couldn't hear them, he knew what they were saying. He knew the stories they told in that saloon, the whispers that grew louder with every glass of whiskey. They were talking about the curse, about the old silver mine, 13 up in the hills behind the gulch, the mine that had a reputation for swallowing men whole, for taking everything and giving back only grief. The mine, they said, was a gaping wound in the earth that never healed. Cole broke his gaze from the woman and looked down at his hands. The friction of the rope had been too much. It had sliced through the thick leather of his right glove, leaving a ragged tear across the palm. A sharp, stinging pain lanced up his arm. He instinctively flexed his fingers, then quickly shook his hand as if to dismiss the injury, turning the torn part of the glove inward, away from sight. He said nothing. Words were a currency he rarely spent. He looped his lariat back into a coil and secured it to his saddle, his movements economical and precise, betraying none of the strain of the last few minutes. He gave a curt nod toward the town. "You'll be safe there. The stable's at the end of the street." He turned to mount Flint, his part in this finished. But the woman slid down from the wagon seat, her boots sinking into the mud. She didn't approach him. Instead, she went to her own horse, her movements slow and deliberate. She ran a hand down the bay's trembling flank, murmuring to it, her touch gentle and reassuring. Then, with a practiced ease that surprised him, she placed 2 fingers on the horse's neck, just below the jaw, feeling for the pulse, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was checking the animal's heart, calming it, assessing the toll the ordeal had taken. It was the action of someone who knew and cared for animals, someone who put their welfare first. After a moment, she seemed satisfied. She looked over at Cole, who had paused with his foot in the stirrup. The rain was beginning to ease now, softening from a torrent to a steady, hissing fall. "Thank you," she said. The words were simple, spoken quietly, but they carried a warmth that seemed to push back against the cold, damp air. It wasn't the effusive, flustered thanks of a damsel in distress. It was the calm, sincere gratitude of an equal. Cole merely dipped his head in acknowledgement, a gesture that was both a dismissal and an acceptance, and swung himself up into the saddle. As he gathered his reins, his gaze swept over the small town huddled against the hillside. It was a collection of raw lumber and false fronts, a place clinging precariously to existence. And as he looked, he saw a final, telling detail. Further down the main street, the lights in the Silver Needle Land Loan Office, the town's only bank, went out. The sturdy oak door was pulled shut, and the distinct, heavy sound of a deadbolt sliding home echoed faintly across the muddy street. Rowan Pike, the bank's owner, was closing up early. It was a small thing, but in a town like Silver Needle, nothing was a small thing. It was a signal, a stark and unambiguous reminder that tomorrow was the first of the month. Tomorrow, the land notes came due, and for men like Cole Mercer, that was a storm of a different, and perhaps more dangerous, kind. He turned Flint away from the bridge and nudged him into a steady walk toward Coyote Bend, the woman's strange words echoing in his mind, and the sting in his hidden hand a sharp, persistent reality. The day after the flood broke a fragile, watery dawn over Silver Needle. The sky was washed clean, a pale and tender blue, but the land below bore the scars of the storm. The main street was a river of mud, thick and deep, sucking at the boots of the few townsfolk who ventured out. The air was heavy with the smell of wet pine and sodden earth. Life in a place like this didn't wait for the ground to dry. It went on. Lila Hart had found her place in the town's abandoned granary. It had been offered to her by the mayor, a weary man who saw the sense in having a healer on hand, even a traveling one. The space was little more than a large, drafty box, but it was dry, and its thick wooden walls offered a sense of solidity. She spent the morning transforming it. With a borrowed broom, she swept a decade's worth of dust and husks into the street. She hung a storm lantern from a central beam, its steady, clean flame pushing back the shadows that clung to the corners. From her wagon, she unloaded her life in wooden chests and leather satchels. Tins of salves and jars of dried herbs were arranged on a makeshift table of planks laid over 2 barrels. She unrolled packages of clean linen bandages, and the sharp, medicinal scent of camphor and carbolic acid began to overlay the musty smell of old grain, staking its own territory. This was how she built her walls with order, with purpose, with the quiet rituals of her trade. Miles away, at Coyote Bend, Cole Mercer was building walls of his own, though his were of split rails and sweat. He was up before the sun, the lingering chill of the storm seeping through his coat. He moved through the dawn mist, his boots sinking into the saturated ground, counting the new calves. There were 7, spindly and slick, huddled against their mothers. They were his future, the fragile promise of a prophet come autumn. He made a quick calculation in his head, 7 new head, against the cost of 50 bales of hay to get the herd through a hard winter, against the price of mending the section of fence the flood had taken out, against the damning number written on the promissory note tucked in his cabin. The math never seemed to work in his favor. Coyote Bend was a hardscrabble place, all rock and stubborn grass, and it fought him for every inch. The land was in his blood, but the note, held by the bank in town, was a noose tightening around his neck. Later that morning, as Cole was resetting a fence post, a rider approached. It was Rowan Pike, the banker, mounted on a fine black mare that picked its way disdainfully through the mud. Pike was a man whose clothes were always clean, whose boots were always polished, a stark anomaly in the gritty landscape of Silver Needle. He smiled, a thin, pleasant expression that never reached his eyes. "Mercer," he greeted, his voice smooth as a worn river stone. "Nasty storm. Hope you didn't lose any stock." Cole finished tamping the earth around the post before he looked up. He wiped a line of sweat from his brow with the back of his gloved hand. They're all accounted for. Good. Good, Pike said, patting his horse's neck. I'm just making my rounds, checking on folks. He let a moment of silence pass, a deliberate, calculated pause. The note's due today. You know, I know what day it is. Pike's smile didn't falter. Of course you do. You're a responsible man, which is why I wanted to talk to you. I've heard some news, good news, for the town. A consortium from back east is buying up the rights to Silver Mine number 13. They're planning to reopen it, bringing in new equipment, hiring men. It's going to mean a boom for this town. He leaned forward slightly in his saddle. Your land, this Coyote Bend. It has water rights to the upper creek. That's going to be very valuable to a mining operation. Very valuable indeed. Cole's face remained a stony mask. It's valuable to me right now. Is it? Pike's voice was soft, laced with a pity that was more insulting than any threat. You work yourself to the bone for a herd that might not survive the winter, on land that barely grows enough grass to feed them. I'm offering you a way out. Cole, a clean slate. Sell the land to the consortium. I can facilitate the deal. You'd pay off your debt and walk away with more money than you'd see in 10 years of ranching. Selling now would be the smart play. Cole picked up his mallet. I'm not selling. Pike's smile finally tightened at the edges. The note. Mercer, don't be a fool. The land will be mine one way or another. This way. You get something for it. He pulled on his reins, turning the mare. Think about it. You have until day's end. He rode off, leaving Cole alone with the ringing silence and the heavy weight of his choice. On her way back from the general store, Sheriff Nora Quinn found Cole on the road into town. Quinn was a woman who seemed to have been carved from the same tough timber as the bridge supports. Her face was weathered, her eyes a clear, steady gray, and the Colt peacemaker on her hip looked as natural as another limb. She wasn't one for pleasantries. Pike pay you a visit, she asked, reining in her buckskin. Cole just nodded. Figured as much. He's buzzing around like a fly on a hot day. She looked out over the valley, toward the dark scar on the mountain that was the entrance to Mine No. 13. A lot of talk about that old hole in the ground. Talk is cheap. She looked back at Cole, her gaze direct. Keep your iron in its leather, and your promises in your mouth. This town's got enough ghosts without us making new ones. It was as close to advice as she ever came. She nudged her horse and continued on her way, a solitary, unbending pillar of law in a lawless land. That afternoon, Cole found himself standing outside the granary. The crude, hand-painted sign read simply, L. Hart, Nursing. He needed the cut on his hand looked at. The torn glove had let in mud and grime, and the wound was beginning to throb with a dull, insistent heat. He hesitated on the steps, then pushed the door open. Lila was inside, organizing bottles on a shelf. She turned, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The memory of the bridge, of the roaring water and her whispered words, hung between them. My hand, he said, his voice rough. The rope. She nodded, her expression becoming professional, her dark eyes focused. Let me see. He held out his right hand. She gently took his wrist, but he didn't remove the glove. She looked at his hand, then up at his face. His eyes wouldn't meet hers. They were fixed on a point somewhere over her shoulder. He had built his wall high. Lila didn't press. With a small pair of scissors, she carefully cut away the torn, stiff leather of the glove, revealing the angry red gash across his palm. She cleaned it with antiseptic that made him hiss through his teeth, her touch firm but gentle. As she worked, wrapping his hand in a clean white bandage, the silence in the small room was deafening. He was a fortress of a man, and she had no key. Just as she was tying off the bandage, the door creaked open again. 2 small children, the Miller twins, stood on the threshold, clutching a pail of milk between them. Ma said to bring this for you, Miss Hart, the little girl said, her voice a shy pipe, for helping Pa with his cough. Lila's face softened into a warm smile. Thank you, Sarah, and you, Jacob. That's very kind of your mother. As she took the pail, Jacob, bolder than his sister, pointed a grubby finger at the mountain visible through the open doorway. "That's where your PA went. Ain't it Ma says the mine took him? She says mine 13's got a curse and takes a man every 10 years. A shadow passed over Lila's face, so fleeting Cole might have imagined it. She just knelt down to the boy's level. "Mines are dangerous places. Jacob, it's not curses we have to fear. It's carelessness." She gave them each a piece of hard candy from a jar on her desk, and they ran off, their mission accomplished. The rumor, however, remained, settling in the dust motes, dancing in the lantern light. Lila Hart, the daughter of a man swallowed by the very mine Pike was so eager to reopen. That evening, the Silver Needle Saloon was humming with the low thrum of speculation. At a corner table, a grizzled miner named Rafe lowered his voice, speaking to the two men beside him. "It ain't natural, I tell ya. I was checking my traps up past the ridge last night. Saw lanterns up at the old mine entrance. Saw men, too, hauling wooden crates from a wagon. Big, heavy ones. Looked like Pike's freight wagon to me. Probably bringing in new timber for shoring," one of the men slurred. At midnight, Rafe scoffed, shaking his head. "In the rain, no. They was being quiet about it. Real quiet. Something ain't right up there." Back at Coyote Bend, Cole sat at his rough-hewn table, the lamp casting long shadows on the cabin walls. He looked at his ledger, at the column of expenses that always seemed to outpace the column of income. He didn't have Pike's money, not even close. His gaze drifted to the window, to the small corral where his 3 yearlings, the offspring of his best mare, were huddled together. They were fast and strong, the best he'd ever bred. Selling them would break his heart, but it would also satisfy the note. It would buy him another season. It was a choice between his future and his pride. And in her makeshift clinic, by the steady light of her lantern, Lila Hart opened a small, leather-bound journal. The pages were filled with neat, precise script, observations on herbal remedies, notes on patients. In the quiet of the night, she dipped her pen in the inkwell and wrote a single, new entry. The words were sharp and clear on the page, a stark contrast to the superstitious whispers that filled the town. "They call it a curse," she wrote. "I call it a trick." The rain that night was different. It wasn't the violent, hail-spitting fury of the flood, but a soft, persistent drizzle that fell from a starless sky. For Cole, it was worse. The gentle tapping on the roof of his cabin was the sound of memory, each drop a chisel chipping away at the walls he kept around his heart. He lay on his narrow cot, staring into the darkness. But he wasn't seeing the rough-hewn timbers of his home. He was seeing the splintered chaos of another barn, on another rainy night, 1 year ago. The memory came in flashes, sharp and brutal as broken glass, the smell of rain-soaked hay and terrified livestock, the shriek of wind tearing at the roof, and the groaning, a terrible, deep-throated sound from the main support beam, a sound he had ignored for too long. He had been meaning to fix it for weeks. He saw his younger brother, Wade, his face boyish and laughing in the swinging lantern light as they worked to calm the horses. Wade, who was 17 and full of the easy confidence that Cole had never quite possessed. "It'll hold. Cole, it's held through worse," Wade had yelled over the storm. Then the groan had turned into a scream of tearing wood, a deafening crack that was not thunder. The world tilted, the lantern fell, its flame licking greedily at a pile of dry straw, and the great central beam, the spine of the barn, had snapped. Cole remembered the weight, the impossible, crushing weight pinning him, the searing heat of the fast-spreading fire crawling up his arms. But more than that, he remembered Wade's voice, small and surprised, from somewhere in the wreckage. "Cole, I can't breathe." He remembered struggling, fighting the timber that held him fast, his own flesh blistering and blackening as he tried to reach his brother. He had been so close. He could hear Wade's ragged gasps, could see the terrified whites of his eyes in the flickering firelight, just beyond a cage of splintered wood. And then he saw the fear drain away, replaced by a terrible, quiet acceptance. And then there was silence, a silence more profound and terrifying than the storm itself. By the time the neighbors pulled him out, the barn was an inferno and Wade was gone. The doctor had saved his arms, but not his hands. The skin was a latticework of slick, white scars, a permanent map of his failure. From that day on, Cole wore the gloves. They weren't just to hide the scars. They were a barrier, a constant, tactile reminder of what happens when you touch things, when you try to hold things together and fail. They were his penance, the wall he built between himself and the world, between the man he was and the man he should have been. The work on the ranch, the silence, the solitude, it was all part of the same wall, built brick by heavy brick, every single day. In town. Lila lit her lantern, the soft hiss a comforting sound in the quiet of the granary. She, too, had her ghosts, and they often stirred on nights like this. She ran a finger over the rim of a tin of antiseptic salve. Its sharp scent was the smell of her purpose, but it could never quite mask the other smell that lived in her memory, the damp, earthy odor of a mine shaft. She had been a miner's daughter. Her father was a man with coal dust permanently etched into the lines of his hands and a cough that rattled the windows of their small shack. He'd worked in Mine No. 13. He'd spoken of it not with fear, but with a kind of grudging respect, as a man might speak of a difficult but honest boss. He believed in hard work, in the promise that if you went deep enough into the earth, you could pull a better life out of it. One day, the earth had simply decided not to let him go. A support timber gave way. They'd said, a pocket of bad air. The explanations were always simple, always clean, and they never explained the gaping hole left behind in a young girl's life. After his death, she'd used the meager insurance money to put herself through nursing school in a city back east. She'd been driven by a fierce, quiet determination. She had a good mind and steady hands, and she wanted to mend the things that were broken. But the city had its own kind of collapsing tunnels. She was praised for her diligence but passed over for positions of real responsibility. Her diagnoses were listened to with condescending smiles by male doctors who then claimed her insights as their own. A woman's touch is for soothing brows. Miss Hart, not for setting bones, one of her mentors had told her, his voice dripping with patronizing authority. So she had left. She packed her medicines and her knowledge into a wagon and set out on her own, a traveling nurse, patching up the forgotten people in the forgotten corners of the frontier. She found a freedom in it, a sense of purpose that no city hospital could offer. But it was a solitary freedom. Her wall was built not of silence, but of service, by constantly taking care of others, by being the one who was needed. She never had to admit her own need. She was the healer, the steady hand, the one who patched up the wounds of the world so she wouldn't have to look too closely at her own. A low, mournful sound drifted on the night air, cutting through the rhythm of the rain, the distant whistle of a freight train, miles away, making its lonely journey across the plains. The sound pulled Cole from his cot. He stood and walked to the door of his cabin, stepping out into the drizzle. He didn't wear a coat. He just stood there, his face turned up to the gray sky, letting the cold rain soak his shirt and plaster his hair to his skull. It wasn't cleansing. It was a confirmation, a quiet affirmation of the chill he carried inside him. He stood like a man accepting a sentence, the train's whistle, the voice of a world moving on, a world he was no longer truly a part of. He was anchored to this spot, to this land, to the memory of fire and rain. In her clinic, Lila was sorting through a stack of old patient cards she'd inherited from the town's previous doctor, a man who had retired years ago. It was mostly a record of coughs, fevers, and broken limbs. She was alphabetizing them, imposing her own sense of order on the town's medical history. Her fingers paused as she read a name on a faded card. Mercer, Wade. Her breath caught in her throat. The card was dated a little over a year ago. The diagnosis was brief, written in a spidery script: severe smoke inhalation, crushing injuries. The final, stark word at the bottom of the card was underlined, twice deceased. She sank onto her stool, the card trembling in her hand. Wade Mercer, Cole's brother. Suddenly, the fortress of a man she had met at the bridge took on a new, tragic dimension. The gloves, the silence, the haunted, distant look in his eyes. It wasn't just hardness, it was grief, sealed up tight. She understood now that his wounds were not just on his hands. She thought of her own father, of the neat, clinical report that had summarized the end of his life. 2 names, 2 sudden, violent ends, 2 lives left to navigate the wreckage. A strange, unwelcome thread of connection was weaving itself between her and the quiet cowboy. The next afternoon, Sheriff Nora Quinn's boots made a solid, purposeful sound on the wooden steps of the granary. She didn't bother to knock. "Miss Hart," she said, her voice flat and devoid of preamble. "Thought you should know. Pike filed the official paperwork this morning. He's been granted a provisional license to reopen mine number 13. He can start exploratory work in 3 days." Lila looked up from grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. The news landed in the quiet room like a stone. 3 days. It was all happening so fast. "On what grounds?" she asked, her voice tight. "Claims he's doing a safety assessment. Says the Eastern Consortium won't invest until the main shafts are declared sound." Nora Quinn's expression was unreadable, but there was a cynical set to her mouth. "He's a man who likes to have all his papers in order." Just then, a powerful gust of wind slammed against the granary, rattling the door in its frame. Outside, the large wooden sign that welcomed visitors to the town of Silver Needle, which had been loosened by the storm, gave a loud groan. One of the iron bolts holding it to its post tore free from the weathered wood. The sign now hung precariously, tilted at a drunken angle, swinging in the wind. Lila and the sheriff both looked out at it. The sign, like the town itself, seemed to be holding on by a thread. The news about the mine, Pike's relentless pressure, the old ghosts that haunted the gulch, it all felt like that same wind, tearing at the loose bolts of their fragile community. An unspoken question hung in the air between the 2 women, as palpable as the coming storm. What was Rowan Pike really looking for up in that mine? And what would happen to Silver Needle when he found it? The sky did not darken with clouds, but with earth. A strange, yellow twilight fell across Silver Needle in the middle of the afternoon, and the wind, which had been a restless whisper all day, rose to a mournful howl. It came from the west, a solid wall of dust and grit scraped from 100 miles of dry prairie. The air grew thick, tasting of clay. Doors slammed, windows were shuttered, and the world shrank to the space of a single room. Inside the granary, Lila Hart was grinding herbs, the rhythmic scrape of pestle against mortar a small, steady sound against the rising shriek of the wind outside. A young mother, Mrs. Gable, sat with her 5-year-old son, Tommy, who was waiting for a poultice for his chesty cough. The storm was an inconvenience, trapping them there, but the lantern cast a warm, safe glow within the sturdy walls. Then came a sound that was not the wind. It was a high-pitched, splintering crack from directly overhead, followed by a violent thud. Mrs. Gable screamed. Tommy, who had been sitting on a crate near the wall, was suddenly on the floor. A cry of shock and pain ripped from his small lungs. A heavy roof plank, a foot wide and 6 feet long, lay beside him, torn from its moorings by a savage gust. It hadn't hit him directly, but its edge had caught him as it fell, glancing off his head. Cole was leading Flint into the relative shelter of the livery stable when the gust hit, a physical blow that staggered him and sent his hat tumbling into the brown haze. He heard the woman's scream, a thin, sharp thread of terror that cut through the storm's roar. It came from the granary. He didn't think. He ran. He burst through the door, his shoulders hunched against the wind, bringing a swirl of dust and debris in with him. The scene inside was one of controlled panic. Lila was already on her knees, her face a pale, focused mask. She had Tommy in her lap, his small body trembling with shock. Blood, shockingly bright against his pale skin, streamed from a deep, ugly gash on his forehead, just above his eyebrow. Mrs. Gable was hovering, weeping, her hands fluttering uselessly. "It's too deep for a butterfly plaster," Lila said, her voice tight but calm. She was already cleaning the wound with a wetted cloth, her movements swift and sure. "It needs stitches, or it will leave a terrible scar." She looked at the boy's terrified, tear-streaked face. He was beginning to struggle, whimpering and trying to push her hands away. "I can't do it if he's fighting me." She looked up then, and her dark eyes found Cole's. The chaos of the room, the screaming wind, the mother's sobs, all of it seemed to recede, leaving only the two of them in a pocket of intense, desperate silence. "I need you to hold his head," she said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper that was for him alone. "You have to hold it perfectly still." It was a simple request, a necessary one. For Cole, it was a command to step into the heart of a fire. He looked at the crying boy, at the blood, at the glint of the curved suturing needle Lila was laying out on a clean cloth. And then he looked down at his own hands. They were covered in worn, stained leather. The right glove was the one she had cut away and bandaged, but he had replaced it with a spare. They were his armor, the layers of cowhide that kept the world at bay. They were the sum of his failure, the symbol of his vow to never again be responsible for the safety of another living soul in a moment of crisis. To hold this boy's head, to be the steady anchor while Lila performed her delicate, painful work, was to break that vow, to use these hands, scarred and useless as they felt to him, for something so vital felt like a sacrilege. He could feel Lila's gaze on him, feel the weight of her expectation. He could feel the memory of fire licking at his skin, hear the echo of a boy's voice fading in the smoke. The storm outside howled, a perfect reflection of the tempest inside him. He stood frozen, a statue carved from indecision. Then Tommy let out a pained, frightened wail, and the sound broke the spell. It was the sound of a child in pain. It was the here and now. Cole took a breath, and then, with a slowness that seemed to stretch time, he reached for the button at the wrist of his left glove. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial. He worked the button free. He peeled the glove back, finger by finger, the leather making a soft, protesting sound. He laid it carefully on the edge of a table. Then he did the same with the right. He unwrapped the bandage Lila had tied, his fingers surprisingly nimble, and set it aside, for the first time in over a year, in front of another person. Cole Mercer stood with his hands bare. The lamplight was unforgiving. It fell on skin that was a stark testament to his past. The backs of his hands and his forearms were the color of tanned leather, the skin of a man who worked under the sun, but his palms, his fingers, the insides of his wrists, they were a ruin, a network of slick, white scars, puckered and raised, twisted across the flesh. They were the tracks of a fire that had burned hotter than the sun, a permanent record of melted skin and a shattered life. Lila looked. She didn't flinch, she didn't gasp. Her dark eyes, which had been sharp with professional focus, softened. They became deep pools of something he had not seen directed at him in a very long time, a profound, aching understanding. He saw the flicker of her own ghosts in their depths. Her eyes glistened, but her expression was rock-steady. She had seen wounds before, all kinds of them. She knew that the deepest ones were not always visible. He knelt before her, his knees sinking into the dusty floorboards. He held out his hands, palms up, an offering of his brokenness. Lila's gaze dropped from his eyes to his scarred hands. She took a small, shaky breath. "You're the only one," she whispered. The words so quiet he could almost believe he'd imagined them. She was echoing their meeting at the bridge, but the meaning had changed, deepened. "Who's held on this long?" As she spoke, she reached out, not with pity but with a quiet sense of purpose. She laid her own hand, clean and steady, directly on top of his scarred one. It was a light touch, but it sent a jolt through him, a warmth that had nothing to do with a fire. It was the first intentional, skin-to-skin touch he had allowed himself in a year. It was not a touch of comfort, but of alliance, a shared acknowledgement of the weight they both carried. "Steady now," she murmured, more to him than to the boy. Cole placed his hands on either side of Tommy's head, cupping his small skull. His touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the ravaged appearance of his skin. He could feel the frantic pulse in the boy's temple, the fine, soft hair beneath his scarred fingers. He met the boy's terrified, tear-filled eyes. "It'll be all right, son," Cole said, his voice a low, even rumble. "Just look at me. Don't look at what she's doing. We'll count the beams in the ceiling." Lila threaded the needle as the fine, sharp steel pierced the boy's skin for the first stitch. Tommy whimpered and tensed, his whole body arching. But Cole's hands were unmovable. They were as solid as the granite of the mountains, a living vice of gentle, absolute strength. He held the boy steady, his own breathing deep and even, his gaze locked with Tommy's, outside, as if on cue. The shriek of the wind began to die down, its fury spent. The roar softened to a mournful sigh, and the dust began to settle. In the doorway, unnoticed by the three people at the center of the room, stood Sheriff Nora Quinn. She had come to check on them when the storm hit its peak. She stood in the shadows, a silhouette against the brown, hazy light. And she saw it all. She saw the discarded gloves on the table. She saw Cole's naked, scarred hands holding the child with a tenderness that belied their appearance. She saw the silent, profound communication that passed between him and Lila Hart. She saw two solitary people building a bridge across their own private desolations. A slow, almost imperceptible nod was her only comment. Then, as quietly as she had arrived, she turned and walked away. Lila worked quickly, her hands a blur of precise, efficient motion. 4 stitches, small and neat as a seamstress's work. She tied the final knot and snipped the thread. It was done. She cleaned the area one last time and applied a clean, white bandage to the boy's forehead. Tommy, exhausted by fear and pain, had gone limp in Cole's hands, his crying subsiding to hiccuping sobs. Cole slowly, reluctantly, withdrew his hands. He looked down at them, at the angry white scars, and for the first time, he didn't see only failure. He saw hands that had held steady, hands that had helped. Misses. Gable rushed forward, scooping her son into her arms, murmuring thanks and blessings through her tears. Cole rose to his feet, feeling suddenly awkward and exposed. He reached for his gloves. He pulled the left one on, the familiar leather a comforting weight. But as he picked up the right, he paused. He looked at it for a long moment. Then, instead of putting it on, he folded it neatly and pushed it deep into the pocket of his trousers, leaving a space open. A possibility. He turned to go, giving Lila a short, curt nod. But before he could take a step, she reached out and her fingers brushed lightly against the back of his bare right hand, tracing the raised edge of a long, thin scar that ran from his knuckle to his wrist. She didn't ask how he got it. She didn't have to. The question was not in her touch, only a quiet, unwavering acceptance. Trust, Cole realized, wasn't just a word. Sometimes it had a shape. Sometimes it had warmth. And right now, it felt like the ghost of a woman's touch on his ruined hand. The quiet that followed the dust storm was heavy and absolute. The world outside the granary was painted in a uniform coat of fine, brown silt. 2 days later, Lila was changing the dressing on Tommy Gable's forehead. The boy, now treating his stitches as a badge of honor, sat remarkably still on a stool, chattering about a lizard he had seen. As Lila carefully peeled back the edge of the old bandage, a faint, acrid scent rose from the cloth. It was sharp, chemical, and utterly out of place. It wasn't the smell of infection, which she knew intimately. It wasn't the smell of any of her own salves or medicines. It was the smell of sulfur, of saltpeter, the smell of a struck match, magnified 100 times. She paused, her fingers hovering over the boy's head. Her mind, trained to observe the smallest detail, began to work. Where had this smell come from? It wasn't on the boy's skin. It seemed to have been trapped in the fibers of the original bandage, an invisible residue left by the dust that had coated everything on the day of the storm. The dust that had been thickest on the plank that fell from the roof. She finished tying the new clean bandage, her movements automatic while her thoughts raced. She gave Tommy a licorice stick and sent him on his way, then stood in the middle of the room, looking up at the ceiling. The granary had been empty when she took it over, but it had been used for storage for years. Pike's Freight Company was the only one in town with wagons large enough to haul significant loads. What had he been storing in here, or what had been stored nearby? Leaving its ghost in the dust, the smell was a loose thread, and she felt a compelling, urgent need to pull on it. She knew she couldn't do it alone. There was only one person in Silver Needles she would trust with a suspicion so formless and dangerous. She found Cole mending a harness in the livery, his bare right hand moving with surprising dexterity as he worked an awl through the thick leather. The left remained gloved. He looked up as she approached, his face an unreadable mask, but his eyes held a question. "I need you to walk with me," she said, her voice low. "There's something you need to see." She didn't explain further, and he didn't ask. He simply put down his tools, and they walked out of the town, away from the main street and the prying eyes that watched from every window and doorway. She led him along the path that ran behind the granary. The ground was still damp and soft from the recent storms. When the plank fell on Tommy Gable, she began, keeping her voice even. It left more than a cut. There was a smell on the bandage, like burnt powder. Cole stopped walking. He looked at her, his blue eyes sharp and focused. "What kind of powder? Sulfur?" "Saltpeter," she said. "Gunpowder." He absorbed this, his gaze sweeping over the back of the granary. "Pike's men cleared out some old freight from there a week before you arrived," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Said they were making room for you." A lie, then, or a half-truth. They hadn't been just clearing space. They had been moving something they wanted kept hidden. Cole's eyes narrowed, scanning the ground. He was a tracker of livestock, a reader of the land. He saw things most people missed. He pointed with his chin. There. The tracks were plain enough, now that he had pointed them out. The deep ruts of a heavy wagon, not the lighter tracks of a farm cart or a buggy. These tracks didn't lead to the granary, but from it, heading west, away from town, toward the desolate stretch of riverbank where the channel had shifted years ago, leaving behind a dry, sandy wash and an old, abandoned boat dock. They followed the tracks in silence. The ruts were a clear trail in the soft earth. As they drew closer to the old dock, Cole knelt, examining the ground more closely. Beside the wagon ruts were the hoof prints of the animals that had pulled it, 2 heavy draft horses. He ran his scarred fingers over the edge of one of the impressions. "Look here," he said. He pointed to the faint indentations left by the nails in the horseshoe. At the toe and heel of the print were tiny, distinct star-shaped marks. "Those are frost nails, for extra grip on rock or ice. Not many smiths around here use them, but the one Pike uses over in Blackstone County does, on all his freight teams." It was a small detail, but it was a solid one, a link. They reached the dry dock, a skeletal collection of rotting timbers half buried in sand and scrub. It was a place of ghosts, forgotten and ignored by the town. And that made it the perfect place for a secret, tucked beneath a stiff, cracking canvas tarp and hidden behind the overturned hull of a weathered skiff. They found it, a wooden crate, or what was left of one. The lid had been hastily pried off, and one of the side panels was splintered and broken. It looked like it had been dropped and then abandoned. Cole moved the tarp aside. The crate was empty, save for a few handfuls of packing straw. But as Lila knelt to look closer, she saw something else coiled in the corner, almost hidden in the straw. It was a length of dark, waxy cord, thick as her little finger. A slow-burning fuse. Her breath hitched. This was no longer a suspicion. This was something real, something dangerous. Cole picked up one of the splintered pieces of the crate's side panel. Nailed to the raw wood was a fragment of a paper shipping label. The letters were black and stenciled, stark and clear. Pike Freight. The rest of the word had been torn away. Lila pulled the small, leather-bound journal and a charcoal pencil from the pocket of her dress. She was no artist, but her hand was steady and her eye for detail was precise. She knelt in the sand and began to sketch the label, replicating the blocky letters, the texture of the wood grain behind them, the exact shape of the torn edge. As she drew, a detail snagged her attention. The label had a peculiar rip in the top right corner, a small, triangular tear with a jagged edge. A memory surfaced, vague at first, then sharpening into focus. 2 days ago. A freight driver had come to her with a nasty cut on his thumb. He said his skinning knife had slipped. She remembered cleaning the wound and noting the unusual shape of the knife he carried. It had a small, sharp hook at the tip, for gutting. The jagged tear in the label, it looked exactly like the shape that hooked tip would make if it caught and ripped the paper. Another thread, small, but there. She added a quick note in the margin of her journal beside the sketch. A crunch of boots on sand from further down the riverbed made them both freeze. Voices, low and rough. Cole reacted instantly. He grabbed Lila's arm, pulling her down with him into the deep shadow of the overturned skiff. They pressed themselves against the decaying wood, their hearts hammering in the sudden, tense silence. 3 men came into view, walking toward the dock. One was Rafe, the miner from the saloon, his grizzled face set in a self-important scowl. The other 2 were strangers, hard-faced men with the watchful, wary eyes of hired guns. They stopped near the broken crate, their backs to where Cole and Lila were hidden. "Did you get rid of it all?" one of the strangers asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Every last stick," Rafe said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the sand. "It's all tucked away safe and sound up at the mine." Pike was real pleased. "He'd better be," the second stranger said, "for what he's paying." Rafe chuckled, a nasty, grating sound. "Don't you worry, it'll be worth it. Tomorrow night, that old mine's gonna do some talking. It's gonna tell this whole damn town that the curse is real, and that land ain't worth a plug nickel. Pike'll pick it up for pennies on the dollar." He kicked at the broken crate. "Should have burned this. Sloppy." The men laughed. The sound was ugly, echoing off the rotting timbers of the dock. It was the sound of vultures circling. They lingered for a few minutes more, their conversation turning to whiskey and women. Then they turned and walked back the way they had come, their shapes swallowed by the twilight. Cole and Lila stayed hidden long after the sound of their footsteps had faded, the silence they left behind even more menacing than their words. Cole's face was grim, his jaw set like granite. "We go to the sheriff," he said, his voice a low, clipped growl. "Now." He started to rise. "No, wait." Lila's hand shot out, grabbing his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Think, Cole. What do we have? We have enough. We have the fuse, the label, what we just heard, and they have denials." She cut him off, her voice fierce and low. "Pike will say the crate was stolen from his warehouse. He'll produce records to prove it. Rafe and his friends will say they were drunk, telling tall tales. It's our word against a respected businessman and 3 miners. Nora will have to investigate, and by the time she does, it will be too late. They'll have already done whatever it is they're planning to do." He looked at her, his frustration warring with the cold logic in her words. She was right. Pike was insulated, protected by his money and his position. "They have to be caught," she insisted, her dark eyes intense, caught with the powder in their hands and the lit fuse at their feet. There can be no doubt, no room for lies. A heavy understanding settled between them. They couldn't go to the law. They had to become the law. They were alone in this. Cole gave a single, sharp nod. He reached into the crate and pulled out the length of fuse. He cut a small, 6-inch piece with his pocket knife and handed it to her. She tucked it carefully into her journal. He then worked the splinter of wood with the partial label free from the crate panel and handed her that as well. She wrapped it in a handkerchief and secured it in a deep inner pocket of her dress. These were their only weapons. As they stood, a change came over the sky. The placid blue of the afternoon was gone, replaced by a bruised, purple underbelly of clouds massing on the western horizon. The air grew still and heavy, charged with an unspoken promise. A low, distant rumble echoed across the plains. It wasn't the sound of a train this time. It was thunder. It sounded like a war drum, beating a slow, steady rhythm, counting down the hours until tomorrow night. The night air in the high country was thin and cold, carrying the clean scent of pine and damp rock. A sliver of a crescent moon was trapped in a web of fast-moving clouds, casting a weak, unreliable light that seemed to make the shadows deeper and more menacing. Below it, the entrance to Silver Mine. No 13 was a black, jagged wound in the mountainside. It didn't look like a mine. It looked like the gaping maw of some great, sleeping beast. And the wind that sighed from its depths sounded like a slow, sleeping breath. Cole and Lila moved like ghosts through the broken landscape. They had left Flint tethered in a grove of aspens a mile back, approaching the final stretch on foot. They kept low, using the deep, muddy ruts left by Pike's freight wagon as their path. The ground was treacherous, littered with loose scree that threatened to shift and betray them with every step. Cole moved with an unnerving silence, his body blending into the darkness. Lila followed close behind, her focus absolute, placing her feet precisely where he had placed his. In her hand, she carried a storm lantern, but its glass was wrapped in 3 layers of thick burlap, turning its bright flame into a dull, barely perceptible glow, just enough to illuminate the ground at their feet. It was their only light in a world of profound blackness. As they drew closer, the low murmur of voices drifted on the wind. They dropped to their bellies, crawling the last 50 yards through the coarse scrub and sharp-edged rocks. They found cover behind a large pile of discarded mine tailings, a man-made hill of gravel and stone that gave them a clear, if precarious, view of the mine entrance. 3 men were there, their shapes stark silhouettes against the yellow light of a single, unveiled lantern set on a wooden crate. It was Rafe and the 2 hard-faced strangers from the dock. They were working with a grim efficiency, wrestling another heavy crate from the back of the same freight wagon, now parked just inside the mouth of the tunnel. "This is the last one," one of the strangers grunted, his voice echoing slightly from the tunnel. "Let's get it set and be done with this." They positioned the crate against a massive, load-bearing timber that was part of the primary support structure just inside the mine's entrance. Cole's blood ran cold. They weren't just planning a small explosion to scare people. They were going to collapse the entrance. They were going to seal the mine, making it look unstable, dangerous, cursed. It was a brilliantly cruel plan. Any attempt to reopen it would now be seen as a fool's errand, a suicide mission. The land would become worthless overnight. Rafe, clearly the man in charge of the technical details, knelt beside the crate. He uncoiled a long fuse, the same waxy black cord they had found at the dock. He worked with a practiced hand, inserting one end into a pre-drilled hole in the crate. He looked up at the towering rock face above the mine entrance, a smug, satisfied grin on his face. 15 years this hole has been quiet, he mumbled, more to himself than to the others. Time it spoke up again. He chuckled, a low, ugly sound. Tonight, we let the curse do the talking for us. He pulled a phosphorus match from his pocket, struck it against a rock, and touched the flame to the end of the fuse. It sputtered to life, a small, angry serpent of orange sparks, hissing as it began its slow, inexorable journey toward the crate of blasting powder. Time seemed to slow down. The hissing of the fuse was the only sound in the world. Cole felt Lila tense beside him, her breath held tight in her chest. He had brought his rifle, an old but reliable Winchester. He had planned for this moment, but the reality of it was a cold, heavy weight in his gut. He rose slowly, smoothly, from behind the tailings pile, the rifle already settled against his shoulder. He wasn't aiming at Rafe. He wasn't aiming at any of them. His sights found the source of their light, the fragile glass globe of the lantern sitting 20 yards away. He took a steadying breath, letting half of it out, the way his father had taught him. He squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shot was shockingly loud, a flat, sharp report that ripped through the night and sent a flock of roosting birds screaming into the air. In the same instant, the lantern exploded in a shower of glass and sparks. The world was plunged into absolute, disorienting darkness. A string of panicked curses erupted from the mine entrance. What in the hell was that? Who's out there? My eyes, I can't see a damn thing, but Lila was already moving. The instant the light died, she was on her feet, a dark shape moving with incredible speed across the broken ground. She wasn't running like a frightened woman. She was running like a surgeon to a patient in crisis. Cole ejected the spent cartridge and chambered a new round, his eyes straining to pierce the blackness, his ears listening for any sound of a threat to her. She reached the sputtering fuse. The men were still blind, their eyes struggling to adjust from the bright lantern light to the pitch black of the moonless night. They stumbled and swore, one of them firing a pistol wildly into the darkness, the shot going nowhere near its target. Lila ignored them. She dropped to her knees, pulling a tool from a leather pouch on her belt. It wasn't a knife. It was a pair of surgical forceps, heavy and steel-jawed, designed for clamping arteries and removing shrapnel. She clamped the powerful steel jaws over the fuse, just an inch from the hissing sparks. She squeezed with all her strength. The waxy cord resisted for a moment, then severed with a dull crunch. The spark sizzled one last time and died. Silence. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the danger was far from over. One of the strangers, his vision beginning to return, saw her a faint silhouette against the slightly less black background of the open sky. With a roar of rage, he lunged. Cole was there an instant later. He met the man's charge with the butt of his rifle, a solid, thudding blow that sent the man staggering backward. The second stranger came at him from the side, a long skinning knife gleaming faintly in the scant starlight. Cole parried the knife thrust with the rifle barrel, the clash of steel on steel ringing in the night. The fight was a chaotic, grunting affair, all flailing limbs and desperate blows in the near-total darkness. There was no skill to it, only a brutal, primal struggle for survival. Rafe, recovering his senses, grabbed Lila, pinning her arms behind her back. "You meddling witch," he hissed, his breath hot and sour on her cheek. Lila drove her heel back into his shin, hard. He yelped in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She twisted free, grabbing the nearest heavy object she could find, a canvas sack filled with sand, left over from the mining operations. Cole, meanwhile, was in trouble. He had managed to knock the knife from the second man's hand, but the first had recovered, and now both were on him. A heavy fist caught him square on the jaw, and his head snapped back. Stars exploded behind his eyes. He stumbled backward, his worn boot heels finding no purchase on the loose gravel at the edge of the mine entrance. He fell hard, his body rolling, and came to a stop with his head and shoulders dangling over the edge of a deep, black ventilation shaft that dropped straight down into the heart of the mountain. He scrabbled for a handhold, his scarred fingers finding only loose rock and dirt. Lila saw him go down. She saw the two men advancing on his vulnerable form. There was no time to think. Hoisting the heavy sandbag, she didn't try to use it as a weapon. Instead, she half ran, half stumbled to the entrance of the main tunnel where Rafe was now fumbling to relight a match. With a desperate grunt, she threw the sandbag directly into the narrow opening, followed by two more that were lying nearby. They didn't seal the entrance completely, but they muffled it, turning the wide-open mouth into a constricted throat. The sounds of their struggle, the grunts and curses, were suddenly deadened, swallowed by the earth, unable to carry to anyone who might be coming to investigate the gunshot. She had contained them, just as the two strangers were about to rush Cole. Another sound cut through the night, a sharp, commanding whistle from the trail below. "Hold it, right there. This is the sheriff's office." The voice was unmistakable. It was Nora Quinn. A moment later, two lanterns appeared on the path, their bright, steady beams cutting through the darkness. The sheriff and two deputies, armed with shotguns, were advancing on the mine. The two strangers froze, caught in the lantern beams like deer. They looked at the armed lawmen, then at the collapsed mine entrance, then at each other. They threw their hands in the air. Rafe, his match finally catching, stared in disbelief. "Sheriff what? How did you know?" Nora Quinn's face was grim in the lantern light. She didn't answer him. Her eyes found Lila, who was standing, panting, beside the sandbags. Nora gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The signal had worked. The night before, Lila had visited the sheriff. She'd explained her suspicions, admitting they were nothing but a hunch built on a strange smell and a torn piece of paper. She couldn't ask the sheriff to act on that, but she had arranged a signal. "If you see my clinic lantern swinging from the rafters 3 times, it means I have proof. It means we need you at the old mine." Just after she and Cole had set out, Lila had slipped back to the granary and given the signal. a desperate gamble that Nora would trust her intuition. The deputies cuffed the three men, their resistance gone. Rafe was sputtering, his bravado replaced by a whining fear. "It wasn't my idea, Pike. He said it was just for protection. To protect his investment, he paid us to make it look like the curse was real." That's all Cole had managed to pull himself back from the edge of the shaft, his body aching, his head throbbing. He pushed himself to his feet, leaning against the rock wall for support. The world was still spinning slightly. The immediate crisis was over. The deputies were leading the prisoners down the trail. The sheriff was examining the crates of blasting powder. The night was quiet again, except for the wind. Lila walked over to Cole. She didn't say anything. There were no words for what had just happened. She looked at the fresh scrape on his cheek, the exhaustion in his eyes. He looked at her, at the smudge of dirt on her face, at the fierce, unyielding strength that seemed to radiate from her small frame. He leaned forward slowly, resting his forehead against hers. It was a gesture of profound, unspoken communication. It was an apology for the danger he'd led her into. It was a thank you for saving his life. It was an acknowledgement that they had stood together in the darkness and had, somehow, found their way through. Her eyes closed, and for a long moment, they just stood there, two solitary people sharing the same exhausted breath, their quiet strength a silent promise in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The church in Silver Needles smelled of old pine, lamp oil, and the collective anxiety of a town holding its breath. Every pew was filled. Men in their Sunday best stood along the back wall, hats in their hands, their weathered faces grim in the flickering yellow light. Women sat stiffly, their hands folded in their laps, their gazes shifting from the makeshift judge's bench at the pulpit to the small, tense group of people standing before it. The building was a house of God, but tonight it was a crucible of man's law, and the air was thick with judgment. At the front, seated behind a heavy oak table, was Judge Abernathy. He was a circuit judge, a man whose face was a roadmap of long, dusty trails and too many nights spent listening to the worst of human nature. His eyes, nested in a web of wrinkles, were tired, but missed nothing. Before him stood Sheriff Nora Quinn, her posture as unbending as a fence post. Beside her, Cole and Lila stood close but not touching, a small island of stillness in the churning sea of whispers. On the other side, flanked by a slick-haired lawyer from Blackstone County, was Rowan Pike. He appeared entirely at ease, his suit perfectly pressed, a faint, condescending smile playing on his lips as if he were merely observing some quaint local custom. "I have read the sheriff's report," Judge Abernathy began, his voice a dry rustle of old paper. "It alleges that these three men, Rafe Miller, Jebediah Stone, and Marcus Cole, at the behest of Mr. Rowan Pike, did conspire to willfully destroy the entrance to the silver mine number 13 using an explosive device, with the intent to create a public panic and fraudulently devalue the surrounding properties." He peered over his spectacles at the three accused men, now sitting sullenly in the front pew under the watchful eye of a deputy. "A serious charge. Sheriff, present your evidence." Nora Quinn stepped forward. Her voice was flat, every word a hard, clean fact. "Your Honor, we found the men at the mine entrance with a lit fuse connected to a crate of blasting powder. They were apprehended after a warning shot was fired by Mr. Mercer here." She placed a series of items on the judge's table, the burlap-wrapped lantern, the length of black, waxy fuse. Furthermore, the miner, Rafe Miller, has given a full confession, stating that he was paid by Mr. Pike to stage the event, to make it appear as though the mine's curse had returned. Pike's lawyer, a man named Sterling, smoothly stepped forward. "Objection, Your Honor. A confession given under duress by a known drunkard is hardly credible. Mr. Miller was likely telling the sheriff what he thought she wanted to hear." Pike himself gave a small, indulgent laugh. "Judge, this is a misunderstanding, albeit a dramatic one. The blasting powder is mine. That is true. It is part of a legal freight shipment, intended for clearing rockfalls in a new tunnel I plan to open. My men were simply moving it to a secure location, as is my right. As for Rafe, He is a disgruntled employee whom I had to let go last month. He holds a grudge." He gestured toward Cole. "The real issue here tonight is not some phantom explosion that, I might add, never happened. The issue is desperation." He produced a folded document from his inner coat pocket and laid it on the table. It was Cole's promissory note. This note, for the deed to the Coyote Bend Ranch, was due 2 days ago. Mr. Mercer has defaulted. He is a desperate man, about to lose his land. Is it not more likely that he concocted this wild tale, perhaps even planting this so-called evidence? In an attempt to discredit me and delay the foreclosure on his property, a murmur went through the crowd. Pike had expertly shifted the narrative. He had turned Cole from a hero into a suspect. Cole's hands, one gloved and one bare, clenched into fists at his sides. He said nothing, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on Pike with a cold, level fury. "The evidence is not planted," Nora Quinn stated, her voice like chipping ice. She held up the splintered piece of wood with the partial shipping label. This was recovered from a broken crate matching the one at the mine, found abandoned at the old dry dock. It is clearly marked Pike Freight. Pike smiled. "A crate that was reported stolen from my warehouse a week ago. I have the paperwork to prove it, Mr. Mercer is a resourceful man. It would not be difficult for him to find a piece of my company's refuse and use it for his own ends. He was deflecting every accusation, turning their evidence into a story of his own victimization. He was winning." It was then that Lila stepped forward. She moved with a quiet grace, her presence a calming influence in the heated room. All eyes turned to her. She held her small, leather-bound journal in her hands. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the fear she felt. "May I present an observation?" Judge Abernathy squinted at her. "You are the nurse. Miss Hart, I am. Proceed." She didn't address Pike or his lawyer. She spoke directly to the judge. As the sheriff stated, this label was found on a piece of a broken crate. I made a detailed sketch of it at the time. She opened her journal and showed him the page. The charcoal drawing was precise, capturing every detail of the stenciled letters and the wood grain. I would draw your attention to the top right corner of the label, specifically to this small, triangular tear. She took the actual wood fragment from the sheriff's table and laid it beside her open journal. The real object and the drawing were a perfect match. Sterling, the lawyer, scoffed. "Your Honor, this is hardly a revelation. The girl made a drawing. What does it prove?" "It proves a connection," Lila said, her voice unwavering. "The day before we found this crate, a freight driver in Mr. Pike's employ came to me to treat a cut on his thumb. His name was Silas. He told me his skinning knife had slipped while he was prying the lid from a stubborn crate. He showed me the knife. It had a small, hooked tip for gutting. The shape of that hook, Your Honor, is unique, and the tear it would make in a piece of paper." She took her charcoal pencil and laid it over her drawing. Tracing the jagged edge of the tear is an exact match. The sketch is not just a copy, it is a key. The piece of the label and the story from Pike's own man fit together perfectly. A hush fell over the church. It was a brilliant piece of deductive reasoning, a connection so fine and yet so undeniable that it seemed to suck the air from the room. It was one thing to deny a drunkard's confession. It was another thing entirely to refute a meticulous, factual observation that linked Pike's employee, a specific tool, and the incriminating crate. Pike's smile finally vanished, replaced by a flicker of cold fury in his eyes. Sterling began to bluster, but Judge Abernathy held up a hand for silence. The judge stared at the journal, then at the piece of wood, for a long, silent minute. "This is compelling testimony, Miss Hart," he said finally. He looked at Pike. "While it is not conclusive proof of your involvement in the events at the mine, it casts significant doubt on your version of events." He leaned back, his fingers steepling under his chin. "I am therefore issuing a court order. The Pike Freight and Loan Office and its warehouse are to be sealed for the next 48 hours. No one is to enter or leave. No documents or freight are to be removed. Sheriff Quinn will post deputies. This will give me time to review Mr. Miller's confession in detail and to consider the implications of this new evidence." Pike's composure cracked. This is an outrage. You have no right, I have every right. Mr. Pike, the judge said, his voice suddenly hard as iron. This is my courtroom tonight. You will abide by my ruling. He banged a heavy law book on the table like a gavel. This hearing is adjourned for 48 hours. The spell was broken. The room erupted in a cacophony of excited, urgent whispers. Cole and Lila were surrounded by a few well-wishers, but most of the townspeople kept their distance, unsure of where to place their loyalties. This was not over. It was only a pause. Cole felt a hand on his arm and turned. Pike stood beside him, his face a mask of cold, controlled rage. His lawyer was busy arguing with Sheriff Quinn. "A word with you outside." "Mercer," Pike hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "On the porch." Cole looked at Lila. She gave him a slight, reassuring nod. He followed Pike out of the stifling heat of the church and into the cool night air. They stood on the wooden porch, away from the departing crowd. The moon was high and cold. "You think you've won, don't you?" Pike said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You and that little nurse with her notebooks, you've won a delay, nothing more." He stepped closer, invading Cole's space. "I am offering you one last chance. The offer I made at your ranch is still on the table. Sign the deed over to me tonight. I will tear up your note. Your debt will be gone, and I will forget all about this unfortunate business. I'm not selling." "Pike," Cole said, his voice flat. Pike's lips twisted into a cruel smirk. "You're still not thinking clearly. You think this is about land. This is about your future. I'm not just offering to clear your debt. I'm offering to keep your secrets." He leaned in, his voice dropping even lower. "There was a fight up at that mine. Wasn't there an assault? You struck my men. A man could be sent to the territorial prison for that. A man with your history, a history of fire and tragedy. People might think you have a violent streak. All it would take is a word from me to the right people." He glanced pointedly at Cole's scarred, bare right hand. "I can make sure everyone knows what you do with those bare hands of yours." It was a vile, brilliant threat. Pike was trying to turn Cole's moment of heroism, his act of courage in defending Lila, into a weapon against him. He was twisting the truth, threatening to expose Cole's deepest wounds and shame to the world. Cole felt a cold dread wash over him. He looked down at his right hand, then instinctively reached for his trouser pocket, his fingers closing around the folded leather of the glove he had stored there. It was a retreat to old habits, a desperate grasp for the wall he used to hide behind. Just then, the church doors opened and Lila stepped out. She didn't say a word. She simply walked over and stood beside Cole. She didn't touch him, but her presence was a tangible thing, a quiet declaration of solidarity. She had heard. She knew what Pike was doing, and she was not leaving Cole to face it alone. Her presence seemed to steady him. He took his hand out of his pocket. Empty. He met Pike's cold, triumphant gaze, and the fear in his own eyes was replaced by a slow-burning resolve. He was no longer just fighting for a piece of land. He was fighting for the man he was becoming, the man Lila saw in him. "I will not," Cole said, his voice low and clear, each word carefully chosen, "sell one half of my heart to save the other." Pike stared at him, his face contorting in disbelief, then rage. He had offered the man an easy way out, and he had thrown it back in his face. He opened his mouth to say something else, something venomous, but just then, the church bell high above them began to toll. It rang out 3 times, the deep, sonorous notes marking the late hour, each one a hammer blow against the silence. 1, 2, 3. It felt like a countdown. The 48 hours had begun. Without another word, Pike turned on his heel and stalked down the steps, disappearing into the darkness. Cole and Lila stood on the porch, the whispers of the last departing townsfolk fading into the night. The bell's echo died, leaving a profound quiet. The battle was far from over. In fact, the most dangerous part was just about to begin. The first night of the 48-hour truce was a liar. It offered a false peace, a sky scrubbed clean by the earlier storms and pricked with the cold, distant light of 1,000 stars. But down in the muddy streets of Silver Needle, the silence was a coiled snake. Cole and Lila knew Pike wouldn't wait. A man like that didn't sit in a cage, even one of his own making. He would chew through the bars. They watched from the deep shadows of the livery stable, their breath pluming in the chill air. They had been there for hours, a silent, two-person vigil. Flint stood saddled and ready behind them, his reins looped over a post, patient as a stone. The front of the Pike freight and loan was dark, a deputy slumped in a chair on the porch, a picture of the law's slow, deliberate process. But Pike wasn't a man who used the front door. Just before the church bell tolled midnight, a sound came from the alley behind the warehouse, a low groan of heavy, unoiled hinges. A moment later, a heavy freight wagon, its canvas top dark against the paler darkness of the night, emerged from a large, previously unseen loading door. It was drawn by a team of 4 powerful draft horses, their harnesses jingling softly, the only sound in the dead quiet. The wagon didn't move like an empty one. It moved with a ponderous, settled weight, the axles groaning under a heavy, hidden burden. The wheels sank deep into the soft earth of the alley. 2 men rode shotgun, rifles held ready across their laps. Pike himself, a grim shadow in a long coat, rode a black stallion alongside the driver. They weren't heading for the main road. They were taking the old, disused track that led west, the one that crossed the river at Cedar Bridge. "He's running," Lila whispered, her voice a puff of white in the dark. "He's not running," Cole said, his voice a low, hard rumble. "He's moving the evidence." They didn't waste another second. Cole swung up onto Flint, then reached down, his bare right hand closing around Lila's arm, and pulled her up behind him. She settled in, her arms circling his waist, her cheek pressed against the rough wool of his coat. He nudged Flint into a silent walk, keeping to the soft earth at the edge of the track, the horse's hooves making almost no sound. They moved through the darkness like a single shadow, a predator stalking its prey. The air grew colder as they neared the river, the mist rising from the water like a shroud. It clung to their clothes, cold and damp, and beaded on Flint's coarse mane. It bit at Cole's exposed skin, 1,000 tiny, icy teeth. Ahead, they could hear the rhythmic clop of the draft horses and the steady, grinding squeal of the wagon wheels. The sounds were their guide, a lifeline in the disorienting dark. Cedar Bridge was a skeletal silhouette against the star-dusted sky. It was a long, narrow span of raw timber, a place of echoes and treacherous footing, with the black, fast-moving water of the Silver Creek rushing 20 feet below. Pike's wagon rumbled onto the planking. The sound suddenly amplified, a hollow, drumming thunder that announced his passage to the entire valley. This was their only chance. Cole urged Flint into a canter, then a gallop. They burst from the cover of the riverside cottonwoods and onto the bridge approach. A shout went up from the wagon. A muzzle flashed in the darkness, a bright orange flower of death. The sharp crack of a rifle echoed off the water. A bullet whined past Cole's ear, close enough for him to feel the heat of its passage. Another slammed into the thick wooden handrail beside them, sending a shower of splinters into the air. Lila pressed herself lower, making herself a smaller target. Cole drew his Winchester from its scabbard, steering Flint with his knees, his movements fluid and instinctive. He fired back, not aiming to hit, but to disrupt. His shot struck the iron rim of one of the wagon's rear wheels. The shriek of lead on steel was a scream in the night, and one of the guards cursed as he was peppered with ricochet fragments. The bridge became a corridor of chaos. Hoofbeats thundered on the planks. Gunshots lit the darkness in strobing, violent flashes. The shouts of the men were raw and panicked. They were caught by surprise, trapped on the narrow span with nowhere to run. Cole saw his target. It was a heavy chain, used to lock the rear axle and brake the wagon on steep descents. It was currently unhooked, dangling from an iron hasp on the wagon's undercarriage. It was a desperate, almost impossible shot. In the dark, from a moving horse. "Hold on," he yelled to Lila. He reined Flint in sharply, letting the horse slide on the damp planks. He rose in the stirrups, the rifle firm against his shoulder. He waited for the next muzzle flash from the wagon to give him a clear, momentary image. It came. For a fraction of a second, The dangling chain was illuminated. Cole fired. The bullet struck the iron hasp with a high-pitched scream. The metal sheared. The heavy chain fell, thick and snake-like, and was instantly caught by the spokes of the turning rear wheel. The effect was catastrophic. The chain whipped around the axle, locking the wheel in an instant. The heavy wagon, still being pulled forward by 4 powerful horses, slewed violently sideways with a shriek of tortured wood and metal. Its rear end slammed into the side of the bridge with a bone-jarring crash, the thick timbers groaning in protest. The driver fought the reins, but the lead horses were panicking, their eyes rolling white with terror. This was Lila's moment. "Go!" Cole roared, firing again at the guards to keep their heads down. Lila didn't need to be told. She let go of Cole and slid from Flint's back, landing on her feet with the agility of a cat. While the men's attention was on Cole, she darted forward, keeping low. She ran not toward the men, but toward the horses. The lead pair, maddened by the noise and the lurching of the wagon, were plunging and rearing. Lila pulled the heavy forceps from her belt. They weren't a knife, but the steel was strong and the jaws were sharp. She reached the lead horse, grabbing a fistful of its mane, speaking to it in a low, calming tone that was somehow audible beneath the din. With 2 powerful, desperate snips, she severed the thick leather traces connecting the horse to the wagon. She scrambled to the other side and did the same, freed from their burden. The 2 lead horses bolted, galloping wildly off the end of the bridge and disappearing into the darkness. The 2 remaining horses, still attached to the wagon, were thrown into confusion, pulling in different directions, their momentum gone. The wagon was crippled, helpless. The violent stop and the collision with the railing had been too much for the heavy, poorly secured crates in the back. 2 of them tumbled from the wagon, crashing onto the wooden planks. The lids, hastily nailed shut, burst open on impact. In the stark, intermittent flashes of gunfire, the contents were revealed. 1 crate was filled with sticks of blasting powder, identical to the ones they'd seen at the mine, but it was the contents of the 2nd crate that stopped everyone in their tracks. It wasn't explosives. It was paper. A thick, leather-bound ledger had fallen out, its pages spilling open. Even from a distance, they could see the neat columns of names and numbers. On the top page, clearly visible, was the name Rafe Miller, and next to it, a payment of $50. Pike let out a roar of pure fury. His plan, his entire scheme, lay exposed on the floor of the bridge. Before he or his men could react, a piercing whistle cut through the night from the far end of the bridge. A voice, cold and commanding as a winter wind, rang out. "Drop your weapons. You are surrounded from the thicket of cedars at the end of the bridge." 3 figures emerged. Sheriff Nora Quinn stood in the center, a shotgun held steady in her hands. She was flanked by her 2 deputies, their own weapons leveled at Pike and his men. They had been waiting. They had been the final piece of the trap. Pike's men dropped their rifles with a clatter. It was over. Pike himself stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent rage, caught between the armed lawmen in front and Cole and Lila behind. "Sheriff, this is a misunderstanding," Pike blustered, his voice a desperate, cracking imitation of his usual smooth tone. "I was simply securing my assets, moving them to a safer location. This is just mine maintenance." Lila walked forward into the circle of lantern light, her journal in her hand. She knelt beside the spilled crate of blasting powder, ignoring the armed men around her. She looked not at Pike, but at Nora Quinn. "When the plank fell in my clinic," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It was covered in a fine dust from the warehouse. I smelled it on the boy's bandage. Saltpeter. From the powder." She pointed to the spilled contents of the crate. "It's the same dust. The same powder that was in the crate that almost killed Tommy Gable is right here. This isn't mine maintenance. This is the weapon he was going to use to terrorize this town, and the ledger he used to pay for it. The wind picked that moment to sweep down the river canyon, clearing the last of the mist. The crescent moon, free from the clouds, cast a cold, silver light on the scene. It illuminated the broken wagon, the spilled evidence, the trapped men, and the unwavering faces of the law. The truth, stark and undeniable, lay bare on the wooden planks of Cedar Bridge. All eyes were on Cole as he walked to the center of the bridge. He stopped beside Lila, a silent guardian. He looked at Nora, at her deputies, at the faces of the men who had tried to kill him. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded right-hand glove. He didn't put it on. He held it for a moment, then let it drop from his fingers. It fell to the planks with a soft, final sound. He stood before them all, under the cold, honest light of the moon, and held up both of his hands, palms forward, the terrible, beautiful map of his scars fully exposed for the world to see. It was a surrender, but also a declaration. "There is nothing left to hide," he said, his voice quiet but resonant, echoing in the sudden, profound silence of the night. The days that followed were quiet. It was a strange, hollowed-out kind of quiet, the kind that comes after a fever breaks or a long siege is lifted. Judge Abernathy's verdict, delivered not in the church but from the steps of the town hall, was swift and decisive. Rowan Pike's assets, his bank and his freight company, were to be temporarily seized by the territorial authorities pending a full investigation. His co-conspirators, faced with Rafe Miller's detailed and unvarnished confession, accepted their fate with a sullen silence. And Cole Mercer's promissory note, the paper noose that had been tightening for months, was officially extended. The new due date was vague and merciful, payable upon the successful sale of the spring calves. The land was safe, at least until the grass turned green again. A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through Silver Needle. It wasn't a celebration. The wounds were too fresh, the betrayal too deep. It was more like a slow, communal unclenching of a fist. The cloud of fear and superstition that had hung over the town for so long had dissipated, leaving behind a clean, clear sky and the hard, practical work of putting things right. For Lila, the change was palpable. As she walked the main street, men who had previously ignored her or offered only a grudging nod now touched the brims of their hats. Their wives, who had watched her with suspicion, now offered a small, shy smile or a basket of late-season apples left on the steps of the granary. They didn't speak of the events at the bridge or the mine. They didn't have to. They spoke through these small, quiet gestures of respect. They saw her now not as an outsider, a traveling curiosity, but as one of their own, the woman who had faced down the town's devil and had not blinked. 3 days after the hearing, the weekly mail coach brought a letter for her. It was an unusual thing. The envelope was thick and creamy, a startling white against the rough wood of her desk. The address was written in a perfect, elegant script, and the postmark was from Santa Aurelia, a prosperous city 100 miles to the south, a place with paved streets and a real hospital. Inside, the letter was from a doctor, Alistair Finch, the chief physician of the Santa Aurelia General Hospital. He had heard of her work. He wrote from a colleague who had passed through the territory. He spoke of her training, her skill, her courage. He was offering her a permanent position, head nurse of the new women's ward. The salary he quoted was more than double what she could ever hope to earn making her rounds in dusty frontier towns. It was a life raft, an offer of security, stability, and professional respect, everything she had once thought she wanted. She folded the letter and placed it on her desk, a crisp, white rectangle of possibility in the middle of her messy, complicated new life. The next morning, she was woken by a sound on her roof, a steady, rhythmic hammering. She dressed and stepped outside into the cool, bright air. Cole was up there, his back to the rising sun, a silhouette against the pale blue sky. He was replacing the plank that had been torn loose in the dust storm, working with a quiet, methodical focus. He was shirtless, and the morning sun glinted off the sweat on his back. He moved with an easy, powerful grace, his bare right hand swinging the hammer, his gloved left hand positioning the nails. She didn't call up to him. She just watched for a while, then went inside and put a pot of coffee on her small stove. When it was ready, she carried 2 tin cups out and set them on the steps. She sat down to wait. An hour later, he climbed down. He didn't seem surprised to see her there. He just took the cup she offered, his scarred fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. He sat on the step below her, the wood still cool from the night. They drank their coffee in a silence that was no longer awkward or heavy. It was a shared space, comfortable and worn. The sound of a blacksmith's hammer rang out from the end of the street. A dog barked, the ordinary sounds of a town waking up. Cole finished his coffee and set the cup down. He stared out at the street, at the slow, familiar rhythm of life. He had not asked her about the future. He had not presumed anything. But the question of what came next hung between them, as real and unavoidable as the mountain that loomed over the town. "If you go," he said, his voice quiet, almost rough, "you'll be safe." He didn't look at her when he said it. His eyes were fixed on some distant point down the road. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of the danger she had put herself in for his sake, for the town's sake. It was a gift. He was releasing her, telling her that he understood if she chose the easier, safer path. He was giving her permission to leave without guilt. Lila looked at the back of his head, at the strong line of his neck. She thought of the letter sitting on her desk, of the clean, safe life it promised, a life without ambushes on dark bridges, without conspiracies and whispers, a life without shadows. "If I stay," she replied, her own voice just as quiet, but with a core of steel. "I need a partner, not a shadow." Now he turned. He looked at her, his pale blue eyes searching her face. He finally understood what she was asking for. It was not a promise of protection. It was not a request for him to be her shield. It was a demand for him to be her equal, to step out from behind the walls of his grief and his silence, to meet her in the light, whole and present. She was not offering to heal him. She was offering to stand beside him while he healed himself. He held her gaze for a long, silent moment. The whole world seemed to pause, waiting for his answer. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He stood up, walked over to the horse trough, and washed his hands and face, the cold water splashing on the dusty ground. He came back and stood before her. He peeled the single, sweat-stained glove from his left hand. He held it for a moment, the worn leather a familiar weight in his palm. Then he took its mate, the one he had dropped on the bridge and later recovered, from his pocket. He laid them both down, side by side, on the top step of her clinic, right beside the door. They lay there like a surrendered weapon, like an offering at an altar. "I choose," he said, his voice clear and firm, "to be barehanded for something decent." He didn't say another word. He turned, climbed back up the ladder, and went back to his hammering, the steady, rhythmic sound, a promise of work to be done, of a future being built, one nail at a time. Later that afternoon, as Lila was grinding herbs, a small delegation appeared at her door. It was the Miller twins, Sarah and Jacob, and two of their friends. They were shy, shuffling their feet in the dust. In their hands, they held a small, lopsided heart, clumsily but lovingly woven from dried summer grass and tied with a piece of twine. They held it out to her, a silent offering, a thank you from the children of the town she had helped to save. Her throat grew tight. She accepted their gift, her heart aching with a feeling so powerful and complex she couldn't put a name to it. That evening, by the light of her lantern, Lila unrolled a map of the territory on her desk. She traced the road south to Santa Aurelia. It was a thin, clear line, a pencil stroke on the paper. It was a known path, leading to a known destination, a life of order and predictability. Then her finger moved back to the small, insignificant dot labeled Silver Needle. The roads leading from it were not so clear. They were tangled, interwoven with the creeks and the canyons. The path to stay wasn't a thin line. It was a thick rope, woven from 100 different threads, the trust of a sheriff, the gratitude of a town, the shy gift of a child's woven heart. And at its center was a single, strong, unbroken thread that was the color of a quiet man's eyes. It was a complicated, messy, and binding rope, and it felt more like home than any straight line ever could. She looked over at the letter from Dr. Finch, its crisp white edges seeming to glow in the lamplight. It was a key to a safe and comfortable cage. The first hint of dawn was turning the eastern sky from black to a soft, pearly gray, A new day was beginning. Lila picked up the letter. She read it one last time, then folded it carefully along its original creases. She did not tear it up. She did not throw it away. She simply tucked it into the back of her medical journal, a road considered but not taken. She had not yet sent a reply. But in the quiet of her own heart, the choice had been made. The sun rose on a world that felt new. The air itself seemed lighter in Silver Needle, scrubbed clean of the heavy, unspoken fear that had been its constant companion. The change wasn't loud or dramatic. It was 1,000 small, quiet shifts in the town's foundation. The most visible of these shifts was taking place in front of the old granary, a new sign, made of a single, wide plank of fresh-cut pine, now hung from the eaves. The wood was pale and smelled sharply of resin. On it, in plain, steady black letters, were painted 5 simple words: Hart Mercer, Medical Station. There was no flourish, no fancy script. It was as honest and unadorned as the 2 people whose names it bore. Cole was on a ladder, his back to the street, securing the final bracket. He worked without his gloves, both hands bare to the morning sun. The town had grown accustomed to the sight of his scarred hands over the past week. They were no longer a source of whispers or morbid curiosity. They were simply Cole's hands, the hands that had held Tommy Gable's head steady, the hands that had helped tame a runaway wagon, the hands that were now, nail by nail, building a piece of the town's future. As he worked, a quiet procession began. It wasn't organized. It just happened. Mrs. Gable was the first, her face full of a quiet, maternal gratitude. She carried a loaf of still warm bread, wrapped in a clean dishcloth, and set it on the station's front step. She didn't say much, just a soft, "God bless you both," before hurrying on her way. A little while later, a grizzled farmer Cole recognized from the church hearing came by. He was a man of few words, his face a testament to a hard life. He silently placed a small burlap pouch on the step next to the bread. It was heavy with the promise of spring seed corn, carefully saved from his own meager supply. He met Cole's eyes, gave a single, profound nod, and walked away. The Miller twins came next, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers, their small faces beaming. They were followed by others: a woman with a jar of honey, a blacksmith with a few newly forged iron hooks, the town's barber, who laid 3 shiny silver dollars on the step, a significant sum. It was not charity. It was an investment. Each small offering was a vote of confidence, a way of saying, "You belong here. You are a part of us now." It was the townspeople, in their own quiet, practical way, helping to lay the foundation of this new beginning. Sheriff Nora Quinn rode up on her buckskin, stopping in the middle of the street. She didn't dismount. She just watched the scene for a long moment, a rare, small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She watched Cole climb down the ladder, his work on the sign finished. She watched him thank the barber, his voice low and sincere. "Mercer," she called out, her voice carrying in the clear air. He turned to face her. "I told you once to keep your iron in its leather and your promises in your mouth." She paused, her gaze dropping to his bare hands, then rising to meet his eyes again. "Looks like you learned to keep your promises with bare hands instead. It's a better way." She tipped her hat to Lila, who had just stepped out onto the porch, then turned her horse and rode on, her duty as the town's moral compass momentarily fulfilled. Cole turned his attention to the station's front door. The old iron hinge was rusted and squealed in protest every time it was opened. He had brought a new one, heavy and black and well-oiled. He set to work, carefully removing the old hinge, his movements precise and unhurried. It was just another small, practical task, another broken thing to be made right. Lila came and stood beside him, watching him work. She held a small, neatly folded square of white linen in her hands. When he had the new hinge in place and was testing the smooth, silent swing of the door, she held it out to him. "Here," she said softly. He took it from her. It was a man's handkerchief, clean and freshly pressed, but in one corner, stitched with fine, dark blue thread in a script as neat and steady as the lettering on their new sign, was a single word: steady. He looked at the word, then at her. It was everything. It was the command she gave herself when faced with a wound. It was the quality she valued most in the world. It was the calm pulse she had felt in the neck of a terrified horse. It was the feeling he gave her, a quiet anchor in the storms of the world and the tempests of her own heart. He ran his scarred thumb over the fine, careful stitches, a stark and beautiful contrast of ruin and repair. They stood together under the new sign, the early sun warming their faces. The air was a mixture of new smells and the sharp, clean scent of the pine sign, the faint, ever-present medicinal aroma of camphor and carbolic acid from inside the station, and the good, honest smell of sawdust and fresh earth. It was the smell of their new life. Lila looked up at his face, at the way the morning light softened the hard lines around his eyes. She thought of their first meeting, of the raging flood and the terror that had her by the throat. She thought of the words she had gasped then, words whose true meaning she hadn't even understood herself at the time. "You're the only one," she whispered, her voice barely a breath of sound. He turned his head, his blue eyes meeting hers, a question in their depths. She gave a small, tremulous smile, the only one who ever got this far. She took a breath, and the last, final brick of her own wall seemed to crumble into dust. "Inside of me. The wall is open now." Cole didn't speak. Words were not his currency. Actions were. He looked down at her hand, hanging at her side. Slowly, he reached out and took it in his. His own hand was bare, and for the first time, she felt the full reality of his scars against her skin. It was not the slick, unpleasant texture she might have imagined. It was a landscape of ridges and valleys, a testament to a history of fire and pain, but it was also warm and strong and utterly real. He held her hand not with the possessive grip of a lover, but with the quiet, firm hold of a partner, an equal. He leaned in, and she tilted her face up to meet his. He kissed her. It was not the desperate, passionate kiss of a storybook romance. It was short, firm, and as real as the calluses on his palms. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of quiet understanding, of a shared and difficult future. It was not a question, and it was not an answer. It was an agreement, a silent nod before the start of a long, hard, and beautiful day's work. As they stood there, the sound of an auctioneer's bell drifted up from the end of the street. A new sign had been nailed to the front of the Pike Freight and Loan Office, its letters stark and official: Property of the U.S., Territorial Authority, Public Auction. The wind, the same wind that had once carried dust and fear, now swirled the dirt in the street, carrying away the last remnants of Pike's reign, and into the quiet space left behind. Another sound rushed in to fill the void, the bright, clear, and utterly hopeful sound of children laughing as they played a game of tag in the sunlit street. Silver Needle was bright again, not because of a lucky strike of silver, not because of some whispered magic in the hills. It shone with a light that came not from the ground, but from within. It was the simple, extraordinary light generated by two people who had looked into the darkness of their own pasts and, against all odds, had chosen to face the dawn, together. A choice they would continue to make, every single morning. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please share your thoughts and your location in the comments below to connect with fellow fans. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and like this video. If you'd like to help this story reach more listeners, please consider hitting the hype button to share it with a wider audience.